It always begins when the world goes quiet. You are lying in bed with your eyes open, staring into a darkness that should feel peaceful, but does not. The room is still. The walls do not move. The ceiling says nothing. Yet inside your head, something has already started. A sentence from 3 days ago returns without permission. A look on someone's face becomes a puzzle you feel forced to solve. A decision you have not made yet begins demanding an answer as if your life depends on it. Nothing is happening in the room, but your body reacts as though everything is. Your chest tightens. Your jaw hardens. Your breathing grows shallow. You are physically safe, but your nervous system is preparing for war. This is the private violence of overthinking. Most people misunderstand it. They call it carefulness. They call it intelligence. They call it preparation. They say they are just trying to be responsible, just trying to avoid mistakes, just trying to think things through. But if that were true, overthinking would leave you clearer, stronger, more capable, more ready to act. Instead, it leaves you exhausted. It steals sleep, weakens presence, paralyzes action, and drains the force you need for real life. It feels active, but it creates no movement. It feels protective, but it makes you fragile. It feels like control, but in reality, it is surrender to inner noise. That is the trap. Overthinking does not enter the mind dressed as weakness. It enters dressed as seriousness. And modern life rewards the disguise. If you are always mentally busy, people assume you care. If you cannot relax, they call you ambitious. If you replay every possibility, it looks like commitment. Quietly, a whole culture has taught you to confuse mental exhaustion with depth. So you keep analyzing, rehearsing, anticipating, revisiting, and calling it discipline. But deep thought and repeated fear are not the same thing. One clarifies life. The other consumes it. The Stoics understood this long before the modern world turned anxiety into a lifestyle. They lived in conditions far harsher than most people today will ever know. They faced war, exile, disease, betrayal, political instability, and sudden loss as ordinary parts of existence. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire surrounded by chaos. Epictetus began life in slavery. Seneca lived under the constant possibility of disgrace and death. Yet these men did not drown in endless mental static. That was not because their lives were easier. It was because their minds were stricter. They learned a truth that still cuts through modern confusion with brutal precision. You do not suffer only from life. You suffer from what your mind keeps doing with life after the moment has already passed. That is why this is not a story about 7 soft self-help tricks. It is a story about 7 Stoic habits that interrupt the mechanism of overthinking at its roots. Not by comforting you, not by flattering you, not by promising that life will become safe, but by forcing a harder realization. You are not tired only because life is heavy. You are tired because your mind keeps trying to carry what was never yours to hold. Think about that carefully. Many people say they want peace, but what they actually want is certainty. They want guarantees, outcomes, approval, control over timing, protection from embarrassment, protection from loss, protection from being misunderstood. They do not want to govern the mind. They want the world to stop being unpredictable. But the Stoics never built their peace on that fantasy. They built it on discipline. They knew that no amount of worry could purchase complete safety. No amount of mental rehearsal could remove uncertainty. No amount of private panic could force life to obey. So the first break has to happen inside your own honesty. You must stop calling every anxious thought wisdom just because it arrived in your voice. Not every fear deserves investigation. Not every internal story deserves belief. Not every thought deserves a future. Human nature produces insight, yes, but it also produces distortion, ego, insecurity, vanity, emotional reflex, and private theater that pretends to be logic. The undisciplined mind gives them all equal authority. The Stoic mind does not. That distinction changes everything, because overthinking is rarely one thought. It is a chain. A memory returns. A meaning is attached. A threat is imagined. A future is projected. An identity becomes involved. Your body reacts. Then the reaction itself becomes more evidence that the thought must matter. By the time you notice what is happening, a whole internal world has formed out of almost nothing. This is why some people are drained before the real challenge even begins. Their energy was spent negotiating with fiction. The 7 habits you are about to move through do not attack anxiety at the surface. They attack the machinery that keeps rebuilding it. They teach division where your mind creates fusion. They teach fact where your mind creates drama. They teach restraint where your fear demands movement. They teach responsibility where your ego craves guarantees. That is where this story begins. Not with peace, not with comfort, not with a promise that fear will vanish. It begins with a harsher offer. You can stop overthinking, but only when you stop worshipping what overthinking promises. Perfect control, perfect preparedness, perfect image, perfect safety. And that is where the first habit enters. It does not arrive gently. It arrives like a blade. The first Stoic habit is ruthless division. Before your mind can become quiet, it must become honest about ownership. What is yours here? Your effort, your judgment, your response, your integrity. What is not yours? Timing, recognition, other people's opinions, the final result. Until that line is drawn, anxiety will keep expanding its empire across territory it can never govern. The exhausted mind is often not overworked. It is overextended. Every empire built on false ownership eventually collapses under the weight of illusion itself. The blade falls with a simple question. What is actually yours here? Epictetus built an entire philosophy on that fracture line. Some things are up to you, and some are not. The sentence sounds obvious until anxiety enters the room. Then the line vanishes. You begin worrying about timing, outcomes, other people's moods, other people's perceptions, whether your effort will be rewarded, whether your honesty will be recognized, whether the future will unfold in a way that protects your image. You throw enormous energy at forces that remain fundamentally outside your command, then call the exhaustion stress. But the real wound is misdirected attention. Overthinking often begins when the mind starts claiming authority over territory it was never given. The Stoic move is not emotional, it is administrative. You draw a line. On one side, your judgment, your effort, your preparation, your courage, your restraint, your speech, your response. On the other side, the final result, the timing of events, the opinions of strangers, the behavior of other people, luck, reputation, and whether life chooses to reward you today. This division does not remove difficulty. It removes confusion. And confusion is the oxygen of overthinking. Once the mind mistakes outcomes for personal property, it can never rest. It keeps scanning, calculating, anticipating, bargaining, and begging for control it will never receive. That is why the first habit is ruthless division. In every situation, ask the colder question. What is mine here? Not what do I prefer? Not what do I fear? Not what would feel fair. What is mine? The answer will usually be smaller than your anxiety wants and more powerful than your ego expects. Because once your responsibility becomes precise, your panic loses space to expand. Much of what keeps people awake at night is not responsibility. It is unauthorized ownership. But drawing the line is not enough. Because the anxious mind has another talent. When it cannot control the world, it leaves the moment. That brings you to the second habit. Amputate time travel. Your mind can move into the past and the future quickly. It can go backward to replay a conversation 100 times, searching for a sentence you should have changed. It can go forward to invent disasters that do not yet exist, then react to them as if they were already happening. While your mind is negotiating with yesterday or trembling before tomorrow, the only place where action is possible keeps slipping away. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That line is quoted often because it is true in a way that embarrasses human pride. Most of what the mind fears never fully arrives. Most of what the mind replays cannot be altered, yet people pour emotional energy into both, as if enough suffering might somehow buy revision or insurance. It never does. It only starves the present. The present moment is the only location where discipline can operate. So when your mind starts spiraling, do not ask the gigantic question it wants. Do not ask how the next 5 years will unfold, whether this relationship will last forever, whether your career will collapse, whether you will eventually become what you hope to be. Those questions are too large for a panicked mind. Ask the next real question. What is in front of me now? The next sentence, the next task, the next breath, the next honest action. Overthinking makes life psychologically enormous. Presence cuts it back down to size. This is not a small habit. The mind loves scale. It loves to turn one uncertain event into a referendum on your entire future. The Stoic response is to refuse false scale. The future may matter, but this moment is where your hands are. Return there with force. And then the third habit enters, sharper than the second. Strip the adjectives from the event. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to look at life before language poisoned it. Events arrive as facts. The mind rushes in and decorates them with story, motive, prophecy, insult, shame, destiny. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A mistake becomes identity. A meeting becomes humiliation. Silence becomes proof. One look becomes judgment. One obstacle becomes disaster. This is where overthinking accelerates, not at the event itself, but at the moment interpretation begins dressing raw reality in catastrophic meaning. So learn to describe what happened without adding fiction. She has not replied in 6 hours. That is a fact. She is losing interest, and I ruined everything. That is narrative. My boss scheduled a meeting for tomorrow. Fact. I am about to be exposed, rejected, and destroyed. Narrative. Your mind always suffers more from the added story than from the original fact. This habit matters because the nervous system listens to language. Call something uncertain, and the body stays more open. Call it final, humiliating, catastrophic, and your organism responds like prey. The Stoics understood that perception is not neutral once imagination takes over, so they trained themselves to separate data from drama. And you can see the chain more clearly. First, the mind claims what is not its own. Then it leaves the present. Then it transforms neutral facts into emotional theater. By the time your body reacts, the world inside you has already become far larger than the world outside you. These first 3 habits cut that process at the root. Draw the line. Return to now. Strip the story back to fact. Do that consistently, and something surprising happens. The mind does not become empty. It becomes governed. And a governed mind is not one that never feels fear. It is one that no longer obeys fear automatically. But the deeper problem has not been touched yet, because even after you divide control, return to the present, and strip fiction from events, a shadow remains. The shadow is what you think would happen if the worst case happened. And overthinking survives, because that shadow has never been forced into the light. The 4th habit is premeditated adversity, the discipline of looking directly at what frightens you instead of letting it float in the background as a shapeless fog. Most people think anxiety comes from thinking too much about what could go wrong. Often the opposite is true. Anxiety survives because the feared outcome stays vague. It hovers behind the mind, like movement behind a closed door. You feel it without examining it. You react to it without defining it. Because it has no clear edge, it expands. And what expands without definition becomes psychologically enormous. This is why avoidance feeds overthinking. The mind keeps circling the feared possibility without ever finishing the thought. If the project fails, then what? If the person leaves, then what? If you are embarrassed, then what? If you are misunderstood, then what? The anxious mind hates these questions because it thinks direct contact with the worst case will increase pain. But the Stoics knew something sharper. What remains undefined keeps more power than what is seen clearly. So the fourth habit asks you to walk the thought all the way through. If the project fails, perhaps you lose status, money, momentum. Then what? You feel pain, you feel shame, you regroup, you start again. If the relationship ends, perhaps you grieve, feel abandoned, question yourself. Then what? You continue living. If people misunderstand you, perhaps your image suffers. Then what? You remain responsible for your character, not their interpretation. When the mind is forced to complete the thought honestly, many catastrophes reveal themselves to be survivable forms of discomfort rather than total annihilation. That difference matters more than people realize. Overthinking is often powered by one silent belief: if the wrong thing happens, I will not know how to remain myself. Stoic practice destroys that illusion. It says the external event may hurt, but your inner task remains. Endure, respond, rebuild, continue. The fear shrinks because it stops looking infinite. And once fear loses some of its fog, another hidden engine of overthinking becomes easier to see. That is where the fifth habit cuts in. Sever the hunger for approval. A person rewrites a message 10 times because they want to sound intelligent, attractive, unbothered, correct. A person delays a decision because they cannot tolerate how foolish it might look if it fails publicly. A person replays a conversation for days because they are trying to repair not only what happened, but how they imagine they now exist in someone else's mind. This feels like caution. Often it is image management. The person is not simply trying to act well. They are trying to remain admirable while acting. Marcus Aurelius saw the absurdity in this. We say we value our own reason, yet we let our peace depend on the unstable opinions of other people, many of whom are themselves ruled by insecurity, distraction, envy, fear, and private confusion. We let imagined audiences move into our head, then wonder why the room feels crowded. The harder truth is that many anxious thoughts are not really about survival or wisdom. They are about vanity in a frightened form. They say, I need to be certain. But often they mean, I need to avoid looking wrong. They say, I just want clarity. But often they mean, I want a guarantee that protects my pride. They say, I care deeply about doing the right thing. But often they also mean, I cannot bear the collapse of how I want to be seen. Stoicism does not flatter that condition. It asks the colder question: what matters more here, your character or your image, your integrity or your performance, your duty or your applause? Once you answer honestly, many anxious spirals reveal how hollow they were. It is refusing to place your internal stability in hands that were never stable themselves. Let them misunderstand you. Let them oversimplify you. Let them underestimate you. None of that changes what is actually yours to govern. Your task remains your judgment, your action, your response. Their reaction belongs to their own mind, not yours. This is the value shift at the center of the whole struggle. Overthinking always reveals worship. If you worship certainty, uncertainty will terrify you. If you worship approval, exposure will terrify you. If you worship control, risk will terrify you. Stoicism does not begin by making you calmer. It begins by asking what false god your mind has been serving. And that question hurts, because many people do not merely suffer from overthinking. They are secretly attached to what it gives them. Without it, they fear becoming careless or ordinary. So the prison starts to feel like identity. That is why the fourth and fifth habits matter so much together. Premeditated adversity strips fear of its fog. Detachment from approval strips ego of its theater. One teaches you that pain is survivable. The other teaches you that embarrassment is not death. Together they close two of the biggest leaks in the mind. But even then, another problem appears. The anxious person often sees the truth and wants to move too fast. They divide control, return to the present, strip adjectives, face the worst case, reject approval, and yet the body still burns with urgency. It wants to send the message now, end the suspense now, fix the problem now, escape the discomfort now. This is where the Stoics become even less sentimental, because sometimes the most powerful response is not action. Sometimes it is disciplined delay. Sometimes the strongest mind in the room is the one that refuses to move before it can see. Stand firm. The sixth habit is strategic non-action. When anxiety rises, the instinct is almost always the same. Do something immediately. Clarify, explain, apologize, decide, send, call, push. End the uncertainty before it can grow. The anxious mind believes motion is safety. It believes the fastest response is the strongest response. But much of what people call decisive action is only panic with a plan. They are not moving because truth is clear. They are moving because discomfort is loud. They understood that emotion distorts scale, motive, and consequence. If they act from that state, they do not usually solve the situation. They pour confusion into it. That is why strategic non-action matters. It is not passivity. It is disciplined restraint. It is the refusal to let the first emotional wave choose your next move. A message sent too early. A confession pushed out of fear. A decision made to escape tension rather than serve truth. A fight prolonged because silence felt unbearable. An apology offered not from clarity, but from the need to stop feeling exposed. These choices often feel relieving in the moment because they discharge pressure. But relief is not the same as wisdom. Sometimes, the desire to act quickly is just the desire to stop feeling powerless. Stoicism demands something harder. Sit still long enough for the mud to settle. Let the body feel what it is trying to outrun. Do not trust every urge to resolve what has merely become uncomfortable. Some situations need a response. Others need time. Some truths become visible only after emotional smoke clears. Strategic non-action is how you stop confusing agitation with instruction. They would rather choose badly than remain in suspense. Suspense exposes the limits of control, and the ego hates that exposure. So it invents action in order to feel important again. The Stoic mind does not rush to restore importance. It waits to restore accuracy. But non-action alone cannot complete the system, because overthinking does not only distort perception, it also traps energy. Hours pass, and nothing external changes, but internally everything feels overheated. Your thoughts are sprinting, your muscles are tense, your breathing is shallow, and your whole nervous system is preparing for movement that never arrives. That pressure has to go somewhere. If it does not leave through action, it turns inward and becomes self-attack. That is why the seventh habit completes the structure. Transmute anxiety into physical execution. The Stoics were not philosophers in the weak modern sense of endless abstraction. Their thought was tied to conduct, endurance, posture, discipline, labor, duty. They understood that the body is not separate from the mind's condition. A mind caught in rumination often cannot be argued into calm at the speed anxiety demands. Sometimes it must be interrupted physically. Walk, lift, run, clean, build, carry. Move until awareness returns to the body, and the body returns you to reality. This is not symbolic. Overthinking creates an internal surplus with nowhere to go. That surplus becomes pressure. Pressure becomes narrative. Narrative becomes identity if repeated long enough. Physical effort cuts that chain. It reminds you that you are not merely a machine for generating thought. You are an organism that stabilizes through rhythm, exertion, and contact with reality. And this is where people often misunderstand the Stoic balance. The sixth habit says do not act impulsively on the situation. The seventh says act decisively with the body. These are not contradictions. They are different forms of order. Do not send the reckless message, but do walk until your breath deepens. Do not make the life-changing decision inside the panic, but do clean the room, train the body, finish the task, move the energy, reclaim the present. One habit restrains external reaction, the other redirects internal surplus. Together they do something profound. They break the illusion that every anxious state must be solved by more thinking. Sometimes, thinking is exactly what deepens the trap. Sometimes clarity comes not from analyzing the emotion, but from refusing to kneel before it. By now, the shape of the system should be visible. Ruthless division teaches you what is yours. Presence teaches you where life is. Plain description protects facts from drama. Premeditated adversity forces fear into the open. Detachment from approval returns your worth to your own custody. Strategic non-action interrupts panic. Physical execution resets the organism. Refusal to carry what is not yours. Refusal to live outside the present. Refusal to let language become poison. Refusal to worship vague fear. Refusal to perform for imagined audiences. Refusal to react before seeing. Refusal to let trapped energy become violence. And yet there is still one more level to confront. Many people say they want freedom from overthinking, but they are attached to the identity it gives them. It makes them feel intense, sensitive, alert, complex, serious. Without it, they worry they will become careless. Simplicity feels almost insulting to a mind that has spent years proving its depth through suffering. So even when the habits work, part of the ego resists them. This is why Stoicism is not merely a method. It is a moral correction. It strips glamour from mental chaos. It says your suffering is not more noble because it is complicated. Your exhaustion is not proof of wisdom. Your private storms are not automatically sacred. What matters is whether your thoughts help you live in reality, act with integrity, and carry yourself with discipline. The question is no longer, how can I feel significant inside my struggle? The question becomes, what response serves truth? Once that question becomes stronger than the need to feel dramatic, the mind starts changing in ways that actually last. Not because life softens, not because uncertainty disappears, not because all fear leaves your body, but because fear stops becoming your commander. And when fear is no longer your commander, something colder and stronger can finally take its place. Rule. Quietly hold ground. People often imagine freedom from overthinking as a warm state. They picture floating ease, emotional softness, a life in which nothing disturbs them deeply anymore. The Stoics offered something different. They offered government, not the government of the world, which remains impossible, but the government of the self. A quieter mind is not an emptier mind. It is a mind with clearer laws. It notices more quickly, interprets less wildly, obeys fear less automatically, and returns more faithfully to what is actually required. That is why these 7 habits matter only when seen together. If you use one without the others, the mind will simply reroute its chaos. You may learn to divide control and still get trapped in the future. You may return to the present and still worship approval. You may face the worst case and still react too quickly. You may move the body and still cling to fiction. Freedom does not come from collecting techniques. It comes from building an order strong enough to withstand your own habits. Look again at what has happened across this story. First, you were asked to stop confusing overthinking with intelligence. Then you were forced to draw the line between what is yours and what is not. Then you were brought back into the only place where action can exist, the present. Then you learned to strip dramatic language from raw events, so the nervous system would stop obeying stories as if they were facts. Then you were made to look at fear directly until it lost its supernatural size. Then your dependence on approval was exposed as a quieter form of slavery. Then you were told to distrust urgent reaction and respect the discipline of delay. Finally, you were reminded that a body in motion can restore reality to a mind that has become trapped inside itself. It convinces you that every thought is an emergency, every feeling is a message, every imagined scenario is a warning, every opinion is a verdict, every delay is danger, every uncertainty is intolerable. Stoicism restores hierarchy. It teaches the mind to rank what deserves attention, fact over fiction, duty over image, action over rumination, endurance over dramatization, character over applause. Alpha, reality over projection. Once these priorities become stable, anxiety still visits, but it no longer takes the throne when it enters. That is the deeper promise hidden inside the title. Stoics did not stop overthinking because they discovered a magical emotional trick. They stopped because they stopped granting unlimited authority to every thought that appeared. They learned to ask harder questions. Is this mine to control? Is this happening now? What are the facts? What is the worst case, clearly seen? Am I afraid of pain or of looking foolish? Do I need action or restraint? Do I need more thought or do I need to move? They cut through the flattering lies anxiety tells about itself. But overthinking rarely protects what it promises to protect. More often, it steals presence from the people you love, courage from the decisions you need to make, rest from body you live in, and dignity from the mind that should belong to you. So the final lesson is not simply that you must fight anxiety. The final lesson is that you must stop admiring it, stop treating it as evidence of depth, stop dressing it in the language of wisdom, stop assuming that inner intensity means inner truth. Some thoughts deserve your labor, others deserve your refusal. The health of the mind depends less on how much it can think than on how well it can reject what should not lead. It does not promise that life will become fair, that people will understand you, that effort will always be rewarded, or that pain can be avoided. Instead, it gives you something better. It gives you a way to remain standing when none of those promises are available. It is enough because life was never going to become certain. People were never going to become completely readable. Future was never going to ask your permission before arriving. Loss was never going to disappear. Embarrassment was never going to spare the careful. Misunderstanding was never going to spare the sincere. You were always going to have to live without total guarantees. Overthinking was only the mind's attempt to bargain against that fact. It was a bargain with illusions. Once you see that, the entire posture changes. You stop trying to think your way into perfect safety. You start training yourself to remain steady without it. You stop asking for a life with no uncertainty. You start becoming a person who can meet uncertainty without kneeling. You stop demanding that fear leave forever. You start refusing to let it write laws inside you. That is how overthinking begins to leave. Not all at once, not dramatically. It leaves in layers. First, you notice it sooner. You trust it less. You recover more quickly. You stop feeding certain loops at all. The mind discovers something it forgot was possible. Silence that is not empty. Stillness that is not panic. Thought that serves rather than rules. Real victory is becoming harder to deceive from within, harder to provoke into private theater, harder to manipulate with imagined futures and invisible audiences, harder to drag away from reality by tricks of the anxious mind. So when room goes quiet again, and it will, and old machinery begins trying to wake itself inside you, remember what has already been built. Draw the line. Return to now. Strip the fiction away. Face the feared image. Release the audience. Delay the impulsive move. Put body to work. Repeat until the storm loses structure. Then hold what remains. Not the illusion of total control. Something better. A mind that knows how to govern itself. And a life that feels inhabited by its owner.